Chapter 2 of Uganda's White Man of Work, A Story of Alexander M. Mackay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Uganda's White Man of Work, A Story of Alexander M. Mackay by Sophia, Lyon, FAHS. Chapter 2 What Happened After the News Was Read. In an office in Salisbury Square in London, a small group of men read Mr. Stanley's newspaper letter. They were men who had been chosen to gather the money given for missions by the churches and to send out missionaries. They were called Secretaries of the Church Missionary Society. "Is there anything we can do for King Mutesa?" they said to one another. "If he is truly longing to be taught about God, will it not be a crime to refuse to send someone to tell him? Even if he is not sincere, ought we not to act as if he were? But who has the heart to ask any young man to go? And who would be willing to give money for the undertaking?" Discouraged by the difficulties they saw, yet unwilling to drop the matter carelessly, they locked the office doors and knelt together to ask the Father to tell them what he wanted them to do. Not long did they wait for an answer to their prayers. The third day after Mr. Stanley's article was published, a letter came addressed to Mr. Hutchinson, Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, which showed that someone else had the needs of Uganda in mind. "Dear Mr. Hutchinson," it read, "often have I thought of the people in the interior of Africa, in the region of Uganda, and I have longed and prayed for the time to come when the Lord would open the door so that heralds of the gospel might enter the country. The appeal of Stanley to the Christian Church from Mutesa's capital seems to show that the time has come for the soldiers of the cross to make an advance into that region. If the committee of the Church Missionary Society are prepared at once and with energy to start a mission to Victoria Lake, I shall gladly give you £5,000, about $25,000, with which to begin. I desire to be known in this matter only as an unprofitable servant." Luke 17:10. The hearts of the committee men beat fast as they read the letter through. It all seemed so wonderful. "God must be in this," they said to one another. "God must be in this. He must have touched the heart of Mutesa and made him want to ask for missionaries. He must have told Stanley to send the plea on to England, and he must have put it into the heart of this Christian man of wealth, whose name we do not know, to make this generous gift. Who are we that we should stand back and say to God, 'No, we are afraid to do our part to help'?" They began to study their geographies and to read magazine articles and books of travel that told about Uganda and the way to go there. By the time a week of such thought and prayer had passed, they decided that they would send letters to different newspapers asking for men and money. Soon another gift of £5,000 ($25,000) was made. This encouraged them to work and pray for even more. How glad they were, not many days later, when they found that the sum of £24,000 in all ($120,000) was ready to be used. These, however, were not the only letters which came to make them glad. Some were from men who had no money to give, but who wanted to give their lives. One was from a retired officer of the British Navy, Lieutenant G. Shergold Smith. One was from an Irish architect, Mr. O'Neill; another from a minister, the Reverend Mr. Wilson; another from Mr. Clark, an engineer; and another from Mr. William Robertson, an artisan; and still another from Dr. John Smith, a physician of Edinburgh. All these men wanted to go, and the secretaries at the office said they would be glad to send them. Another, however, a carpenter, Mr. James Robertson, they refused to send because of his poor health; but having already sold out his business, he said he would go and pay his own expenses. These 7 men, with one other, made up the party who, in answer to Stanley's newspaper appeal, sailed a few months later for Mutesa's land. This other was the youngest of them all, a Scotchman named Alexander Mackay. He pronounced his name Mackay. He wrote from Germany, where he was gaining a reputation for himself as one of the head men in an important machine factory. His business was to draw plans for large engines. Even when a boy, Alexander had always been fond of machinery. Living in a little Scottish village, when a lad of about 12 years, he used often to walk 4 miles to the nearest railway station and 4 miles back, just to see the engine puff into town, hauling a train of cars, stop a minute or two, and then steam off again. His good natured fun made him a great favorite at the village blacksmith's, at the gas works, at the carding mill, and the carpenters' shops. Often he would visit these places, for he liked to watch the men and the machinery as they did their work. While he was at grammar school in a larger town he could almost never be induced to go on holiday excursions with the other lads. Instead he would slip away to a photographer's, where he would learn how to use a camera, or he would find his way to the shipyards to watch the builders as they covered the steel ribs with timbers, placed the masts, and sewed the rigging for fishing schooners. During his college course, too, those studies were most to his liking in which he could make something with his hands. His father wanted him to be a clergyman, but the boy did not favor the suggestion. He was, however, a true Christian. The thought of going as a missionary to some heathen land came to him when a child. His father used to talk with him about the new discoveries in Central Africa, and his mother often told him stories about missionaries. More than a year before Mr. Stanley's plea was published, Mackay had read an appeal for Christian doctors to go to Madagascar. Although he knew that thousands of Christians on that island had suffered death as martyrs, he purposed, if it seemed to be God's wish for him to do so, to go to Madagascar as an engineering missionary. By this he meant that he wanted to go to that uncivilized island to teach the natives to build roads, bridges, railways, to work mines, and to learn to use the various kinds of machinery, and so help them to become more useful Christians. A strange sort of missionary, you say. This is what many of his friends thought too, for they never before heard of a mechanic becoming a missionary. But it did not change Mackay's purpose. He began at once to prepare for his work by studying the language of the people of Madagascar. This plan, however, was changed for a better one. On a bitter cold night during the Christmas holidays of 1875, he finished reading Stanley's book, How I Found Livingstone. Laying the book on the table, he noticed an old copy of the Edinburgh Daily Review. His eyes fell on the words, Henry Wright, Honorary Secretary, Church Missionary Society. His curiosity was at once awakened. He had found one of the appeals sent out by the secretaries in London, asking for men to go out as missionaries to Mutesa's kingdom. Mr. Mackay, then and there, although it was after midnight, wrote to Mr. Wright offering to go to help teach Mutesa's people how to be useful Christians. My heart burns for the deliverance of Africa, he wrote, and if you can send me to any one of these regions, which Livingstone and Stanley have found to be groaning under the curse of the slave hunter, I shall be very glad. So it all came about that in that quiet old committee room of the Church Missionary House one April day, the 8 young men bound for Uganda said goodbye to the committee men who stayed home. One of the secretaries, speaking for the rest, gave the young men their last instructions. Then each of the party replied in his turn. Mr. Mackay, being the youngest, was the last to speak. "There is one thing," he said, "which my brethren have not said, and which I want to say. I want to remind the committee that within 6 months they will probably hear that one of us is dead." He paused, and there was a solemn stillness in the room. Then he went on. "Yes, is it at all likely that 8 Englishmen should start for Central Africa, and all be alive 6 months after? One of us at least, it may be I, will surely fall before that. But," he added, "what I want to say is this: when the news comes, do not be cast down, but send some one else immediately to take the vacant place." By the end of April all the party had sailed. The goodbyes were hard to say. Friends, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, and for some, their wives and children, they might never see again. Yet their gladness was more than their sorrow as the steamship put out to sea. They believed that the Heavenly Father was their pilot. He had raised the money, He had called the workers, and they were now going with Him. 5 long weeks at sea! Then down by the equator, a few miles off the east coast of Africa, the voyagers at last sighted the island of Zanzibar. There, in the city of Zanzibar, the busiest seaport in East Africa, they landed. But the kingdom of Mutesa lay about 1,000 miles beyond. By foot or on donkey's back they must travel through a wild tropical country for a distance as far as from Washington to Chicago. Even then, the next to the largest lake in all the world, and a very stormy and treacherous one it is, too, would still separate them from Mutesa's land. In these days of railroads and telegraphs it is difficult to understand how hard it was in 1876 to prepare for a journey of 1,000 miles into the interior of Africa. On leaving the coast, the missionaries would say goodbye to stores of every kind. Nothing could be purchased at any price in the country through which they would march except food, such as the black man ate, elephants' tusks, animal skins, bark cloth, and slaves. Even these could not be bought with silver or gold or with paper money. African chiefs would insist on bead money and on such things as red caps, handkerchiefs, cloth, wire, guns, and gunpowder for pay. Before setting sail from Liverpool, the missionaries had spent weeks in hurrying to and fro from store to store. They had ordered books, clothing, medicines, hammers, nails, spades, saws, hatchets, axes, chisels, a forge and bellows, shovels, grindstones, a pump. These do not cover half the list. Perhaps the most unique articles in their outfit were a printing press, a magic lantern, a music box, and a steam launch. Much of the bulkiest baggage was left to be purchased in Zanzibar. No trudging around, however, from store to store this time. As soon as the news spread about the town that a party of Britishers had arrived bound for Victoria Lake, merchants from India and Arabs began to call on them. A list of the articles needed was carefully made out and the goods ordered. After several days there came to the house where the missionaries were staying a number of half naked Indian coolies. In one of the houses surrounding the courtyard they stacked scores of bundles of varied shapes and sizes. First came boxes of dried foods, pans, kettles, and dishes. Most of the camping outfit was purchased in Zanzibar, including tents, white umbrellas, waterproof sheets, blankets, cots, and stools. The largest bundles of all, however, were filled with African money. By the door were laying piles of small change, handkerchiefs, and red caps. Over in one corner the coolies were rolling $50 bills, bales of colored and striped cotton cloth. Then came the bead money, bags of large beads and small beads, oval beads and round beads, some blue, some red, some green, and some white. At last the coolies, panting with heat, lugged in the heaviest bundles of all, huge coils of brass wire, thousands and thousands of yards. Handkerchiefs, red caps, cloth, beads, and brass wire, together weighing hundreds of pounds, were all to be used as money. The baggage being collected, the next problem was how to get it carried across the country to Mutesa's kingdom. Having nothing but crooked, narrow trails for roadways, the missionaries were obliged to travel as the Arabs had always done before them. This meant picking their way on foot, single file, mile after mile, and using black men as beasts of burden. Now even sturdy black baggage carriers will not march with a burden on their heads weighing more than about 60 pounds. So all the white men's freight had to be taken from the trunks and boxes and repacked. The boxes were opened, their contents spread on the ground in piles of the size and weight of one man's load. Then shaping each pile, if possible, into the form of a large pillow bolster, they wrapped it in several thicknesses of cloth and tied it tightly with strong rope. When neither rain nor rough handling could harm what was within the wrappings, the bundles were ready for the heads of the African porters. While some of the missionary band were busy packing supplies, others were toiling at perhaps the hardest work of all. Trudging from hut to hut in the Negro quarter of Zanzibar, they were hiring baggage carriers. Others, having crossed the channel to the mainland, were plodding about from village to village working at the same trying task, for as many as 500 porters were needed. For many weeks this search dragged along. Finally it was decided to divide the missionary party into 4 caravans, so that some could begin the march before all of the 500 baggage carriers were found. 2 of the caravans had not yet started when the angel of death visited the camp. "Within 6 months you will probably hear that one of us is dead," Mr. Mackay had said to the committee before leaving England. Within 4 months the prophecy was fulfilled. On a little island off the coast a grave was dug for the body of James Robertson the carpenter, who had gone with the party at his own expense. He had given his life for a king and a people he had never seen. The next to last caravan to leave the coast was Mr. Mackay's. Crowds of people from the town of Bagamoyo flocked to see the white man and his procession file out of the village. A bugle call had summoned those hired for the journey to gather before the white man's quarters. A man's load was given to each carrier, and his place in the procession was assigned. First marched a half a dozen soldiers, who never had even carried guns until Mr. Mackay began to train them. Then came the leader of the porters with a load on his shoulders twice as heavy as anyone else carried. He was followed by about 200 men loaded with their 60-pound pillow bolsters. Behind them straggled the wives of a few porters, an aged father, and a handful of small boys. Next walked in a line of 4 donkeys laden with parts of a steam launch, other machinery and tools, and much of the cloth. After them marched Mr. Hartwell, a sailor, who was now Mr. Mackay's only white companion. He was followed by a cook, Mr. Mackay's personal servant, 3 stoker boys, an interpreter, an African mason, and a carpenter. Last of all came a group of soldiers, Mr. Mackay and a dog. It was an interesting procession for the townspeople to watch, for marching single file they stretched along the path for about a quarter of a mile. Talking and laughing and singing, the long line wound here and there through the tall jungle grass, down some little valley or up a tiny hill. But the sun shone hot above them and the path was hard and dry. In an hour or so the heat became oppressive. The orderly line grew irregular. Some straggled behind, blaming Mr. Mackay for their discomfort. Those accustomed to march walked steadily on toward a river about 3 miles distant, where they knew they could rest, but some of the experienced ones were already lying flat on the ground, crying for water and bewailing that they had ever been such fools as to leave their homes. During the first few days the caravan proceeded very slowly. The men insisted on marching only an hour or two in the morning, and on resting all the next day. By promising higher wages if they would march longer each day, Mr. Mackay succeeded in getting them to march from sunrise or so. By promising higher wages if they would march longer each day, Mr. Mackay succeeded in getting them to march from sunrise or soon after until about noon. The country through which they passed varied greatly from day to day. Sometimes they pushed their way through fields of grass as tall as themselves, or even higher and having stalks almost as thick as sugar cane. Every now and then they were startled by a hippopotamus or an antelope scared from its hiding place in the heavy grass. Starting off again, they came to a swamp more beautiful to look at than to wade through. It was filled with large, graceful ferns and beautiful pink flowers. At night it was alive with fireflies. The missionaries thought this sight worth going hundreds of miles to see. They also passed through fields of millet growing to a height of 16 or 18 feet. At another place they were refreshed by the cool shade of a park-like forest. The giant cacti and euphorbia trees made it seem very different from the woodlands at home. They discovered gorgeous butterflies and many birds of brilliant plumage that their friends in England had never seen. Sometimes the forest changed to jungle. Then, with an axe and a hatchet, foot by foot, they had to slash a wider path in front of them before the donkeys could wedge their way between the two walls of underbrush on either side. You would have enjoyed seeing how Mr. Mackay fed his large family of 200 blacks. Reaching a place near a water supply where it was planned that the caravan would spend the night, tents were pitched and the goods piled under a tree or in a tent. When in a district where wild beasts were common, a fence of thorns was built around the camp. As soon as this work was completed, the head men of the caravan collected before Mr. Mackay's tent and cried, "Pasho Bwana," rations, master. Instead of handing out food to them, he had a bale of calico brought to him, and measuring it by the length of the forearm from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, he gave each one 8 of these lengths for every 16 men of whom he had charge. With these pieces of calico for money, these men went to the natives of the place and bought their own food. "To be a father to such a large family of children," wrote Mr. Mackay, "every day crying out 'Pasho,' which means 'Give us our daily bread,' is by no means a joke. Their little disputes and complaints I have to settle. My interpreter is poor in English and sometimes says just the opposite of what I mean. Still, we get on wonderfully well." Water at times was harder to find than food. More than once the caravan was obliged to set up camp and with empty water bottles to walk forth in search of something with which to quench their thirst. When no spring could be found, the natives would dig holes in the ground which would usually fill with a muddy looking liquid resembling soap suds. With such as this, blacks and whites alike had to be content. Fortunately, Mr. Mackay had very few sick men to take care of. In a caravan a little in front of his, smallpox was raging severely, and here and there along the road lay the bodies of men who had died on the march. In order to escape the tracks of this caravan, Mr. Mackay left the regular road, and for 2 days he and his men waded knee-deep through a mixture of black mud and water. Through his attempt to hustle the slow-going African, Mr. Mackay overtaxed himself and was taken sick with the African fever. For a few days he was too weak to walk and was obliged to ride one of the donkeys that had been carrying baggage. At last, however, the feverish coast plains were left behind. Gladly they climbed the mountains to the little town of Mpwapwa. They had traveled only a little further than from New York to Boston, yet the march had dragged along for 6 weeks. At Mpwapwa 3 of the missionary caravans met. For a few days the white men rested and prepared for the journey ahead. How they enjoyed their after-dinner chats as they sat together in one of the tents telling the experiences of the march. Only a few days at Mpwapwa, and then 2 of the caravans are off again, made up of Dr. Smith, Mr. Mackay, and over 300 baggage. Only a few days at Mpwapwa, and then 2 of the caravans are off again, made up of Dr. Smith, Mr. Mackay, and over 300 baggage carriers. But their first Sunday they overtook another one of the caravans ahead, led by Lieutenant Smith, the old naval officer. For 30 or 40 miles beyond them stretched a dreary plateau covered with a thick, low jungle. Not a human being lived in all this lonely forest, and the caravan could find neither food nor water except what they carried with them in knapsacks and water bottles. After days of this tiresome march, they entered the wide open land of Ugogo. Here every few miles was a new village, and with every group of villages they found a new chief. Each chief insisted that to travel through his country was a privilege, and the white man would have to pay for it. The paying of this toll, or honga as they called it, added not only a great deal of expense to caravan travel, but also caused many annoying delays. Their experience with one of the chiefs of Ugogo will show something of the manner in which they were treated in many villages. A short distance from the chief's village the caravan encamped. The following morning 2 of the more intelligent Africans were sent to call in the chief and to take him a gift of some cloth. They found a monarch much soiled with dirt and grease sitting on a stool in his wattled hut drinking pombe. He received the cloth, but demanded a great deal more. 50 cloths, he insisted, was none too much. The messengers claimed that such a demand was robbery, and hour after hour they quarreled with him. At nightfall the messengers returned to camp and reported, "The chief is sitting at pombe and won't hear reason. He says, 'The white man is a great sultan in his own country, and he must pay a big honga.'" The next morning they returned to the mud palace and again tried to reason with the stubborn chief. Later in the day Lieutenant Smith himself entered his majesty's presence and added his word of protest. Finally the chief agreed to receive 45 bales of cloth. The troublesome matter being settled, Lieutenant Smith thought he would entertain the chief with some of white man's wonders. Taking a match box from his pocket, he struck a light. The chief was frightened, or pretended to be, and cried, "The white man is trying to kill me." Rushing from his hut, he disappeared. Later he sent to the missionaries' camp to say that for such a serious offense they would have to pay as forfeit 25 bales of cloth more than had already been given. So the privilege of camping for 3 days in this chief's realm cost the missionaries 70 bales of cloth, or about $100. When the cloth was paid, the big drum of the village was beaten, and the caravan knew that they were at liberty to proceed on their way. On entering Ugogo, Mr. Mackay's fever had returned, and for miles he had to be carried in a hammock. There being good water in the land of this ruler, he would like to have stayed longer in his domain. He feared, however, that more honga would be charged him if he remained. What should he do? Just beyond lay a 9 days' wilderness, and immediately after that was another that would take 3 days to cross. No water and no food were to be found in these jungles, and the caravan's supply of provisions was very low. Lieutenant Smith and Dr. Smith urged him to return to the coast. Hard as it was to turn back, Mr. Mackay finally yielded to the counsel of his friends. Lying in a hammock swung from the shoulders of 2 strong men, Mr. Mackay was carried back to the town of Mpwapwa, over the path by which he had just come. 8 others carried his tent, instruments, clothes, cooking utensils, and some cloth with which to buy food. At one time he became so weak that he expected to die. Calling for a writing desk, he mixed an ink powder and commenced what he thought would be his last letter on earth. But during the night a change for the better came. Mr. Mackay said a bunch of home letters had been his best medicine. In 11 days he walked the entire distance from Mpwapwa to the coast, and on reaching Zanzibar he was almost a well man. It was now the last of November, 1876. 1 year had passed since Mr. Stanley's letter had appeared in the Daily Telegraph. A band of 8 young men from Great Britain had started from Mutesa's land. One had laid down his life at the very gateway of the continent. One, having started inland, had been stricken with fever and was obliged to begin the march anew. One had settled at Mpwapwa to start a mission there. The other 5, with their hundreds of black carriers, were plodding along through jungle and swamp and over mountain and plain toward Victoria Lake. But what of King Mutesa? Since Stanley left, no word had come from the white men. Were they going to leave him sitting in darkness? When would they ever come and teach him how to see? End of chapter 2.